This is Nightly Business Report with Tyler Matheson and Sue Herrera.
Winter chill, how big a dent did the cold weather across much of the country leave on last month's auto sales?
Stern words, oil rebounds as the Israeli Prime Minister warns the U.S. against accepting a weak nuclear deal with Iran.
High-stakes hearing, the future of the Affordable Care Act, falls to the Supreme Court now, where arguments will be heard tomorrow about the legality of one of its main provisions, subsidies. All that and more tonight on Nightly Business Report for Tuesday, the 3rd of March.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome. A hangover on Wall Street one day after the NASDAQ closed above 5,000 and the Dow Jones Industrial Average and S&P 500 hit records. But the markets just couldn't hang on as investors kept a close watch on three things: auto sales, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's forceful speech to a joint meeting of Congress, and the House vote to fund Homeland Security. But it was those monthly sales figures from the major automakers that set the tone for the day. Sales mostly rose, even as brutal winter weather blanketed parts of the country. But for some, that just wasn't enough. Chrysler missed estimates despite sales increasing nearly 6%. Ford's numbers were off by 2%, much worse than expectations. The standout was General Motors, posting a 4% rise, better than expectations as truck sales surged. Shares of Fiat Chrysler and Ford slumped, while General Motors rose a fraction. Phil LeBeau has more on last month's auto sales.
Pardon the pun, but February auto sales were colder than expected. Sales last month rose about 5%, with the pace coming in at 16.23 million. That was below estimates of a pace of closer to 16.6 or 16.7 million. For the major automakers, almost all of them reported sales that were below Wall Street estimates, Ford being the one that reported a decline in sales, with sales dropping 1.9%. What happened last month? Blame it on the weather. Storms really hurt showroom traffic, especially in the Northeast, where sales fell by as much as 50% in some markets because of the repeated snowstorms. Add in ice storms in the Southeast late in the month, and that's a big reason why sales slowed down in the last week of February. That said, there were a couple of bright spots. Pickups and SUVs are still in heavy demand. In fact, GM truck sales were up more than 30% last month. The real question is what happens with auto sales this month? That's because March is the beginning of the spring auto sales season, where we really start to see business pick up. If the weather improves, most dealers around the country are expecting that we should see auto sales move substantially higher. Phil LeBeau, Nightly Business Report, Chicago.
Well, stocks were sandbagged today by those auto sales results, and some traders say a decline in equities was basically to be expected following yesterday's big records on the Dow and the S&P, and the NASDAQ nipping above 5,000. By the close, the blue chip Dow index was off 85 points to 18,203. NASDAQ lost 28, back below 5,000, and the S&P 500 was down 9. The energy market spent much of the morning focused on Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu's stern warning to Congress about American efforts to strike a multinational nuclear deal with Tehran. In a joint meeting of Congress, Netanyahu made it clear he thinks Iran can't be trusted.
The greatest danger facing our world is the marriage of militant Islam with nuclear weapons. To defeat ISIS and let Iran get nuclear weapons would be to win the battle but lose the war. We can't let that happen.
The reaction was seen for a bit in the oil markets, with WTI crude rising and then giving back some gains. It settled at $50.52. Brent also saw gains today, about 2.5%, as you see there. Jackie DeAngelis has more.
The oil market reacting to geopolitical news today after Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu addressed a potential nuclear deal with Iran, saying, quote, "This is a bad deal, a very bad deal. We're better off without it." Crude saw an initial spike on the Prime Minister's words, but then pared some of its gains when President Obama reacted.
Let's wait until there's actually a deal on the table that Iran has agreed to, at which point everybody can evaluate it.
The significance of deal or no deal is Iran's oil supply. If we do get a deal, the U.S. could lift sanctions on Iran. Its oil could flood the market and depress prices further. If we don't get a deal, we could see the market work through the supply that it already has, and prices could slowly rise again. A deadline for the talks is late March. Crude managed to settle over $50 a barrel, with Brent crude over $60. Oil prices have been hovering in this range for weeks. What could be some of the short-term catalysts? Well, to the downside, a dollar that continues to strengthen after hitting an 11-year high today. To the upside, news tomorrow that inventories are tightening. For Nightly Business Report, I'm Jackie DeAngelis.
John Harwood joins us now with more on the Israeli Prime Minister's speech and the other piece of action in the nation's capital, that House vote to fund the Department of Homeland Security. Good to see you as always, John. Let's start with Iran, if we could, and Mr. Netanyahu's impassioned plea to Congress not to do this deal with Iran. And then the president came back and said there was nothing new in the speech.
Well, Sue, the president delivered a very eloquent and powerful speech. It may not have been new, but it was well delivered. It drew a very enthusiastic reaction from Congress, members of both parties, even though many Democrats had boycotted the speech. And the acid test is going to be what is the reaction if, in fact, we get a deal? The president has said the chances are less than 50-50. Negotiators continue to work in Switzerland, that is Iran and the P5+1, which includes Britain, France, Russia, China, Germany, all trying to strike this deal. So, you know, is Prime Minister Netanyahu going to be able to turn political or public opinion strongly against it? Is he going to deter a deal from being struck? We're going to see that play out over the next few weeks.
You know, John, it was rich irony that Secretary of State Kerry was literally in Switzerland at the same time this speech was going on. My question for you is, what role does Congress have to play in this? The president, in his rejoinder after the speech, made it very clear, hey, look, the executive branch is paramount with respect to striking deals and foreign policy. What role does Congress have to play here?
It's a little murky, at least to me, Tyler. A couple of things. First of all, there is sanctions legislation that Congress has enacted, and to the extent that a deal would lift sanctions, that could involve a role for Congress. I got different answers from aides on the Hill, different answers from members of the same party. So there doesn't seem to be a clear consensus, and Mitch McConnell indicated after the speech today that he's going to attempt to push legislation to the Senate floor to have Congress weigh in on this deal. So this is a bit of a moving target. Democratic Senator Bob Menendez, who was the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, now is the ranking member, had been pushing sanctions legislation last year. They held off on pushing that through the Senate. Mitch McConnell is going to try to do something as soon as he can arrange it that might impact the negotiations in Switzerland.
Let's move to the Department of Homeland Security legislation, and the House did pass it. So what's next, John?
What's next is John Boehner, the House Speaker, breathed a very major sigh of relief because he and Mitch McConnell have vowed we're not going to have shutdowns, we're not going to have crisis management, and John Boehner was undercut by more than 50 members of his own caucus last Friday who took the interim deal that he had made with Democrats and the members of the Senate, and they submarined that deal. Now that John Boehner went to them this morning and said, we got no choice, we got to pass funding, we'll see whether members of Congress learn their lesson from that misfire and give John Boehner a little more maneuvering room going forward.
All right, John, thank you so much. John Harwood in Washington. Ty?
Well, from the I've seen this movie before department, the Congressional Budget Office is warning about the federal debt limit, saying if it's not raised, the Treasury Department will run out of cash by October or November. The government can rely on accounting maneuvers to keep the government afloat until then. Does this all sound familiar? Without congressional action to raise the debt limit, the government would default on its obligations.
The Affordable Care Act is back at the Supreme Court. The 9 justices will hear a major challenge tomorrow to a key provision of the Affordable Care Act, subsidies. Some say the outcome has the potential to derail the president's signature achievement, and it all hinges on just a few words. Hampton Pearson has more.
Tomorrow, the Supreme Court justices will hear the biggest challenge to the Affordable Care Act since the landmark 2012 decision upholding the individual mandate. This time, opponents of the mandate are challenging the government subsidies offered to those who get their coverage through the health insurance marketplaces run by the federal government. The challengers and leading conservative legal scholars say the law is crystal clear. It says subsidies should go only to people who get insurance through an exchange established by the state.
The challengers in this case, who are some low-income Americans who don't want to purchase insurance, and who, but for the subsidy, would not be required to purchase insurance, because the subsidy compensates their low income and makes them eligible for the individual mandate under the statute.
It's estimated that over 7 million Americans signed up for insurance through the federal government exchange and will receive a subsidy to cover all or part of their coverage. The Obama administration will argue it was not the intent of Congress to pass a law that leaves out so much of the country. And supporters say there are numerous references to subsidies for all Americans in the 900-plus pages that make up the Affordable Care Act.
If you want to talk about providing health care to more Americans or controlling health care costs, let's have that conversation. But let's don't have a bait and switch and really have a conservative assault on a fairly modest effort to establish health reform in the United States.
While there's no constitutional showdown this time, the stakes are nearly as high as 3 years ago. A ruling in favor of the challenges could gut how the Affordable Care Act functions. For Nightly Business Report, I'm Hampton Pearson in Washington.
Craig Garthwaite joins us now to discuss what's at stake for many businesses and the millions of people who are now covered under the Affordable Care Act. He's assistant professor of strategy at Northwestern University's Kellogg School of Management, where he specializes in health care. Professor, welcome back. Let's just cut to the chase here. Would an adverse ruling out of the Supreme Court effectively end the Affordable Care Act as we know it?
Well, certainly in the sort of 30-plus states that chose to use the federal exchange rather than set up their own exchange, the citizens there would lose access to subsidies. Many of those people would be unable to afford insurance, and the exchanges in those states would effectively cease to run effectively. Premiums would go up, lots of people would be uninsured. And so in those states, you'd see the beginning of the end of the ACA.
What about businesses if these subsidies are indeed nixed? What businesses would be most affected?
Well, certainly the first businesses you want to look at are hospitals. If you think about how our healthcare system works, hospitals have really served as the de facto insurers of last resort. If you don't have insurance and you are sick, you go there, you get care. If you're unable to pay, hospitals often eat those costs, and it has a big effect on their bottom line. The ACA changes that for many of those hospitals by insuring tens of millions of Americans. We're going to see hospital bottom lines do better. And so it's no surprise that those hospitals have been strong supporters of the ACA, and in particular have opposed any attempts to limit the subsidies through the Supreme Court.
I would think also that insurance companies would be massively affected here because they have counted on a non-adverse risk pool, to use the term of art here, around which they have based all of their pricing. If the risk pool changes dramatically, these companies, whose stocks have gone up a lot as a result of all the new customers they've gotten, I would think they would suffer.
Absolutely. I mean, we sort of gave a deal to the insurance companies where we said, listen, we're going to make sure people buy insurance. We're going to give them subsidies. We want you to participate in the exchanges and develop plans that are offered throughout the states. Now we're sort of changing the rules on those companies. And you point out very well that you're going to get a selected pool where probably the sickest people will remain in. And many of these products might actually just ultimately go away because they can't survive in a world in which we don't have a subsidized pool that's buying insurance.
So those would be some of the losers, certainly, but who would be some of the winners?
I mean, winners are sort of tough to find here. People who oppose the Affordable Care Act obviously are going to like a ruling that eliminates the subsidies because it will be the beginning of the end of the law. You could imagine a world in which we had a sort of well-functioning legislative and executive body that would take a ruling against the ACA, come together, and develop a better, more well-crafted law. That's not really the world that we live in, though. And so what you'd see is the ACA is going to go away, or large portions of it, and those would be the winners, per se.
I understand also that the so-called employer mandate might well be affected here because it hinges in part on companies that have more than 50 employees, but for whom at least one or more employee receives some sort of subsidy. If there's no subsidy, there's no employer mandate, Craig.
Right. It's definitely going to weaken the employer mandate in those 30 states because those employers are only going to pay a penalty if your employee shows up on the exchange and receives a subsidy. Your lowest income employees won't qualify for subsidies anymore. So in those places, you'll see the mandate weaken dramatically. The bad part about that is there's also going to be states, though, where if people don't get insurance from their employer, they can't go to the exchange to get insurance because we're going to effectively end a well-functioning exchange market in those states.
All right, Craig, thank you very much. A very thorny issue indeed. Lots at stake here. Craig Garthwaite, Northwestern University's Kellogg School of Management.
Thank you.
And still ahead, are outflows at PIMCO's flagship fund starting to slow as its performance rebounds? Investors pulled more than $8 billion out of PIMCO's flagship total return fund last month, the 22nd straight month of withdrawals, but it's less than the $11 billion of outflows in January. Over the past 5 months, the total return fund, formerly run by PIMCO's founder Bill Gross, has handily whipped its benchmark and its Morningstar intermediate peer category as well.
We begin tonight's market focus with a restructuring announcement from Target. The retailer plans to cut thousands of positions as part of an effort to reduce costs by $2 billion over the next couple of years. It also gave full-year earnings guidance. It was better than estimates and says it plans to buy back $2 billion worth of shares this year. And well, those shares were up today, a fraction to $78 even. Best Buy reported better than expected quarterlies on a strong holiday season. On that, the retailer declared a special dividend, 51 cents a share, boosted its quarterly dividend to 23 cents a share, and the company will buy back $1 billion worth of shares, first repurchase since 2012. The stock was 1.5% higher today, finishing at $39.18.
Lumber Liquidators saw its shares reverse course today. As we told you yesterday, the stock sold off after 60 Minutes on CBS reported that the company sold flooring with higher levels of formaldehyde. But today, Janney Capital Markets upgraded their rating on the stock to buy from neutral, saying fears generated by the program are overblown. Shares popped 5% to finish at $40.78. Activists sold some $21 billion in bonds today. The 10-year bond was priced to yield about 3.8%, which was at the lower end of guidance, showing strong investor demand for one of the largest corporate bond offerings on record. The stock fell just a fraction to $296.23. Shares of restaurant company Bob Evans fell sharply after the bell, after the company misses earnings and revenue estimates for the quarter and issued light guidance for the year. The company also said it will not spin off its food unit and has hired J.P. Morgan to advise on strategic options for its real estate. Shares fell more than 15% after the close, but rose a fraction during the regular session to $59.64.
Well, people are changing the way they shop, not just what they buy, but how and where they buy it. And that is creating big challenges for some of the country's biggest consumer companies. Sarah Eisen has more.
It's fast, it's easy, it's fast, it's convenient for me.
When it comes to buying the basics, more and more people are turning to their computer, like Christy Steer, who rarely steps foot in a store these days.
Now I can pretty much shop for just about anything that I want online. I still shop for clothes, but I also definitely use it for household items, for cleaning products, for things that we just regularly use in the house.
The latest data from Consumer Edge Research show so-called consumables, everyday household products, are now tied with media. Think online books and movies as the second most popular category bought online. Number 1 is apparel. And while most of the population still buys their consumer products at grocery stores or drugstores and only 9% on the internet, the fastest growth is online.
There are definitely some websites that are kind of a conglomerate of a couple different stores all in one website. I love when I can buy dog food and cleaning products and snacks for the kids all on one website.
No site has been as influential as Amazon.com. With the rise of services like Amazon Prime, which promises free 2-day shipping on most everything, the idea of buying a 6-pack of paper towel rolls online makes more sense today than ever before. That explains why more people buy household items on Amazon than any other category, except for its bread and butter, media.
Last year was my trial year with Amazon Prime, and I kept my Sam's Club membership, and I figured I would use both and see which one I save more money on, and I think the Amazon Prime is going to come out on top.
These shifts are essential for consumer companies trying to understand not just what their customers want, but where they want to buy. For instance, Procter & Gamble just appointed its first ever brand president in charge of e-commerce sales. These companies have always focused on building relationships with brick-and-mortar retailers like Walmart, but now they need to pivot from the decades-old fight for the space on the shelf to the ever-changing battle for space on your screens. That transition is proving challenging for heavyweights like P&G, Colgate, Kimberly-Clark, and others. As a result, it's created an opportunity for upstarts like Dollar Shave Club and Jessica Alba's The Honest Company, among others. Companies that sell recurring, subscription-based, and often cheaper household items like diapers and razors online. That will only add to pressure on the consumer giants in the years ahead. For Nightly Business Report, I'm Sarah Eisen.
Coming up, tropical diseases pose a growing threat to some areas of the United States. And now one company is looking into ways to fight them.
400 million people around the world are affected by a tropical disease that's not widely discussed. It's called dengue fever, and there are no treatments or vaccines currently available. And now the U.S. is starting to see some outbreaks. Meg Terrell has more from Key West, Florida, on one company that is doing something never done before to try and keep that disease at bay.
This is one of the areas that I need to crawl under.
Patty Sprague is on the front lines of a fight experts hope to keep off U.S. shores.
These are my people. I don't want my people to be bitten or to have mosquitoes. So it's like hide and seek every day.
Mosquitoes, specifically the Aedes aegypti, carry diseases like dengue fever and chikungunya. They've been on the rise, and the U.S. saw some of its first outbreaks of dengue in decades in 2009 and 2010. The disease usually isn't fatal, but can be incredibly painful. It's nicknamed breakbone fever, and there are no treatments available. Here in Key West, the southernmost part of the United States, mosquito control experts are doing everything they can to make sure dengue doesn't return.
Dengue is a kind of a sleeper disease. It can exist in low levels without us knowing it and then flare up.
One method has never been tried before in this country. Officials here are working with British biotech company Oxitec to unleash genetically modified mosquitoes programmed to wipe out their own species. Oxitec is now awaiting a go-ahead from the FDA to start a trial in a small area here on the Keys.
What we've seen in all the trials we've done to date is we've actually brought down the population of this mosquito in the areas where we've released by over 90%.
Oxitec releases male mosquitoes to mate in the wild. The offspring they produce quickly die off. There's been some local pushback to the plan over concerns with genetic modification. But Keys experts in Oxitec say the method is safe and targeted specifically to the Aedes aegypti mosquito, a non-native species here. And because Oxitec only releases male mosquitoes, the genetically modified bugs won't bite people, only females do. Meanwhile, big pharma companies are working on the problem. Both Merck and Sanofi have dengue vaccines in development, important as dengue cases have risen 30-fold in the last 50 years. Sanofi alone is reported to have spent more than $1.7 billion in the last 2 decades on the program. As the Florida Keys looks to test the bugs in the U.S., experts are also looking ahead to next year, when the Olympics land in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil.
It's a huge focus. Having that many people from that many countries in a tropical area all crowded together, it's a big concern.
Oxitec has received initial approval in Brazil to release its genetically modified bugs there, among many efforts to control the mosquito population as the Olympics loom. For Nightly Business Report, I'm Meg Terrell in the Florida Keys.
And that is Nightly Business Report for tonight. And we want to remind you, this is the time of year your public television station seeks your support.
On behalf of your public TV station, thank you for your support. We'll see you here tomorrow.